8:30 in the afternoon. April 30th, 1945, a door closes in a concrete room, 50 feet under a dying city. And then, one sound. Muffled, almost small, compared to everything that's been happening above it for the past 2 weeks. A single gunshot. That's it. That's the sound that ends the Second World War in Europe, for all practical purposes. Not an army collapsing, not a city falling. One door, one room, one bullet. The man on the other side of that door once commanded 4 million soldiers. He once stood in front of stadiums packed with 100,000 people who screamed his name until their voices gave out. He once believed genuinely, completely believed, that he was going to rule the world for the next 1,000 years. 10 days ago, he was still giving orders to those 4 million soldiers. Today, he can't give an order to a single one of them, because in every direction that matters, there's no one left to give it to. So how does the most powerful man in Europe end up? Here, in a room with no windows, commanding an army that, by the end, exists only on a paper map, tracked with a pencil. For divisions that stopped answering their radios days ago. Rewind 10 days. Because the story of how Adolf Hitler goes from a birthday party with cake and medals to a bullet in a concrete bunker is not the story you think it is. Most people assume it ends with a battle, some final, dramatic last stand. Tanks against tanks. Soldiers fighting to the very last breath in the streets above him. That's not what happens. What actually happens is stranger, and in some ways more damning, than any battle could be. It's not a story about a battle. It's a story about a man who spent 12 years demanding that other people die for his decisions, and who, when his own turn finally came, discovered he had absolutely no army left to make dying easier. Think about the sheer scale of what he's throwing away by this point, without even realizing it, or perhaps realizing it completely, and simply refusing to say so out loud. 4 million men, at the war's peak, wearing his uniform, obeying his chain of command, dying in numbers that still, 80 years later, resist easy comprehension. Cities leveled, borders redrawn, an entire continent's map rewritten in blood, because one man in a bunker believed, with total and unshakable conviction, that his will alone could bend history into whatever shape he wanted. And in these final 10 days, that will finally meet something it cannot bend. Reality. Not a rival general. Not a smarter strategist. Just the simple, mathematical fact that armies which no longer exist cannot be ordered to attack, no matter how loudly or how many times the order is repeated. 10 days. One bunker. One bullet. This is how it happened. April 20th, 1945. Berlin doesn't sound like a city anymore. It sounds like a heartbeat that keeps skipping. A deep, hollow thump, rolling in from the east every few seconds, closer than yesterday. Closer than an hour ago. Soviet heavy artillery, walking toward the center of the city, one street at a time. 50 feet below the ruined Reich Chancellery, none of that is allowed to exist. Not today. Today there's cake, fresh flowers, stiff salutes from men trying to smile with their mouths while their eyes do math they won't say out loud. It's Adolf Hitler's 56th birthday, and for 1 hour, the last free hour he'll ever spend above ground, the war is not invited. He climbs the stairs into the Chancellery garden. It's the last time in his life he sees open sky. Think about that for a second. A man who once flew across Germany multiple times in a single day, addressing rally after rally, who once stood on balconies looking out over crowds stretching further than the eye could follow about, to spend his last 10 days on Earth, never once seeing the sun again. The garden is a crater field now, marble in pieces, trees stripped to black fingers, and waiting for him in 2 crooked lines, boys, Hitler Youth, 14 years old, some of them lying about being 14. Just pulled off the front line east of the city, a real front line, with real Soviet tanks, and now they're being decorated for it. He walks the line slowly, pats a cheek, asks a name. On camera, he looks tired. His left hand trembles constantly now. He keeps it tucked behind his back, out of frame. Because 6 miles from where he's standing, Berlin's outer defense ring is already broken. And 40 miles away, 2.5 million Soviet soldiers, 6,000 tanks, 40,000 guns aren't racing for Berlin anymore. They're already arguing over who gets to plant the flag first. Nobody in that garden says it out loud. Nobody has to. This is the last photograph. In 10 days, he'll be dead. And every single person clapping in that garden right now already suspects it. They just don't know it's exactly 10. Watch that footage closely. Watch how the boys' eyes track him the way soldiers watch a man they've been taught, their entire short lives, to worship. Some of them will be dead within the week. Watch the men standing just behind him too, Goebbels, Bormann, generals in uniforms still creased and clean, because there's no front line left close enough to dirty them on. They clap on cue. They smile for the camera. And underneath every smile is a private, terrified countdown that none of them will admit is running. Because 2 days from this exact photograph, the man in the center of it is going to scream at his own generals for 45 straight minutes over an army that was never real. Look at the men standing behind those crooked lines of boys a little longer. There's a rhythm to how they hold themselves, the practiced stillness of soldiers who've learned over 12 years. Exactly how much emotion is safe to show on camera. Some of them have already started making arrangements nobody talks about openly. A wife and children quietly moved further west, weeks ago. Documents, currency, small valuables, packed into a bag kept within reach. None of it discussed in the briefing room. All of it understood. The way soldiers understand things they'd be shot for saying out loud. The boys don't have that option. They don't have a bag packed. They don't have a wife sent west. They have a rifle, a metal pin crooked on a jacket, 3 sizes too big, and in order to return to a front line that, by the time some of them arrive back at it, will have moved half a mile closer to the exact garden they're standing in right now. To understand what happens in that garden, you have to understand the 4 months before it. Because Hitler didn't arrive at that birthday party by accident. He arrived because everything else had already run out. Rewind further to January 1945. Along a 900-mile front, the Soviet Union launches one of the fastest offensives of the entire war. 2.25 million soldiers cross the frozen Vistula River. German command estimated the Red Army needed weeks to prepare something like this. It takes them days. Divisions that were supposed to be full strength turn out to be paper 300 men where there should be 3,000. Tanks with no fuel. Artillery with no shells. By the end of January, Soviet spearheads have pushed 300 miles in 3 weeks. Onto German soil, not conquered territory. German soil the farmland families had lived on for generations. Behind that front line, a different horror unfolds. Millions of civilians, mostly women, children, the elderly, because every man who could hold a rifle has already gone flee west in the dead of winter. Carts jam the roads, people freeze in ditches, refugee ships are torpedoed with thousands still aboard. Historians estimate more than 10 million German civilians will be displaced from the east by the war's end, one of the largest forced migrations in human history, unfolding at the exact moment Berlin's radio broadcasts are still describing orderly, controlled withdrawals. Picture one column of that migration. On a single night in February, a farming family from East Prussia. 4 generations on the same land, now reduced to a single horse-drawn cart carrying what could be loaded in 20 minutes. The grandmother remembers the last war, the first one, and keeps insisting this can't possibly be as bad. The children don't understand why they can't go back for the dog. The temperature that night falls well below freezing, and by morning along that same road, there will be carts abandoned where a horse simply gave out, and small mounds at the roadside marking where someone's journey ended before it reached anywhere at all. This is not an isolated story. It is one column among thousands, stretching across the entire eastern half of a collapsing country, all of it moving in the same direction. Away from an army that Berlin's own radio broadcasts insist is still holding firm. Berlin's answer to this catastrophe tells you everything about where the regime's head is. Not retreat, not negotiation. Conscription. The Volkssturm, the People's Storm, is Germany's last reserve, and it's less an army than a confession. Boys of 15, men in their 60s and 70s, some of them veterans of the First World War, called back 30 years later. armed with whatever's left in the depots. Trained, when they're trained at all, for a matter of days. By March, the Soviets reached the Oder River, the last natural wall, before Berlin, less than 50 miles out. Germany scrapes together everything left for one final stand, the Seelow Heights. 100,000 German troops, dug in, facing nearly 1 million Soviet soldiers backed by 8,000 guns, on a front barely 20 miles wide. When the attack starts April 16th, the noise alone is reported audible from Berlin. The German defenders at Seelow have one thing working in their favor that Soviet planners hadn't fully accounted for. General Gotthard Heinrici, one of the most capable defensive commanders left in the German army, correctly predicts where the main Soviet assault will fall and quietly pulls his forward troops back from the first line of trenches hours before the barrage begins, a decision that means the initial, colossal Soviet artillery bombardment meant to obliterate the German front line instead lands largely on empty ground. It buys precious time. It does not buy victory. Soviet commanders, frustrated by the unexpected resistance and under enormous pressure from Moscow to take Berlin before the Western Allies can even approach it, simply pour in more men, more tanks, more artillery, until sheer weight of numbers grinds through what skill and preparation had briefly held back. Seelow holds for 3 days. 3 days against odds that should have broken in 3 hours. It's the last genuinely competent defensive stand of the entire war, and it still isn't enough. By April 19th, the line breaks. There's nothing left between the Red Army and Berlin except Berlin itself. Historians estimate that roughly a third of all German military deaths in a war that had already run 5.5 years happen in its final 10 months. The war is being lost slower than it needs to be lost. And the cost of that slowness is boys who should be in schoolrooms and grandfathers who should be retired. And 40 feet underground, one man is still convinced this can be turned around. There's a particular kind of terror in this period that doesn't show up in any casualty count. The terror of a soldier who spent years being told his army was invincible, watching it disintegrate over a single winter. Veterans who fought competently in France, in North Africa, on the plains of Ukraine, now find themselves retreating through their own hometowns past their own family's front door, in some documented cases, with orders to keep fighting for streets that will be Soviet-occupied within days no matter what they do. Some keep fighting anyway, out of discipline, out of fear of the military police combing the retreat routes for deserters. Others quietly discard their uniforms in ditches, hoping to pass as civilians long enough to survive whatever comes next. Goebbels' propaganda machine is still running, still printing newspapers, still broadcasting radio programs, but the gap between what those broadcasts claim and what soldiers and civilians can see with their own eyes has become an open secret nobody dares say aloud. Announcers describe elastic defensive maneuvers and planned withdrawals to prepared positions, while on the ground, those same positions get overrun so fast that some units never even receive the order to retreat before Soviet tanks are already past them. He's about to prove exactly how wrong that conviction is, and it's going to happen in front of witnesses. The Führerbunker was never built to be a home. It was built for air raids, somewhere to wait out the bombs, not somewhere to run a country from, and definitely not somewhere to die in. By April 1945, it's both. 30 cramped rooms, 2 levels, bare bulbs, pipes lining every corridor. Diesel generators run constantly, filling the lower level with an oily hum that never stops. No windows. No real sense of day or night, just a clock on the wall that, increasingly, nobody down here trusts to mean anything. And crowded into this concrete box is a cast of people watching the same man fall apart at different speeds. Joseph Goebbels has moved his entire family, in his wife Magda, and their 6 children, the youngest just 4 years old. He's one of the last people left who still speaks to Hitler with something close to genuine devotion instead of fear. He's convinced himself this collapse is a kind of tragic, operatic ending, that history will remember their loyalty even in defeat. Martin Bormann is the opposite. Cold, calculating, positioning himself as the last gatekeeper to Hitler's ear, controlling who gets in and what information gets through. Eva Braun came to Berlin voluntarily against Hitler's own instructions to stay away. While almost everyone with the means to leave is trying to leave, she came in. She spends her days trying, almost unbearably, to hold on to some sliver of normal life. She dances, plays records, writes letters that read like she's describing a hard winter, not the death of an empire. There are secretaries, several barely into their 20s, typing Hitler's dictation, unaware they're about to become the last living witnesses to how this actually ends. One of them, a young woman who had been hired years earlier, in part because Hitler liked the fact that she came from Munich and knew shorthand, will spend the rest of her long life being asked the same questions over and over. What was he like? At the end, was there any moment of doubt, any flicker of remorse? She will spend decades wrestling publicly with her own answers to those questions, becoming, almost against her will, one of history's most direct windows into a room that almost nobody else survived to describe from the inside. There are guards. There are military aides shuttling between the bunker and what's left of the city's defenses, bringing reports that get grimmer by the hour. And there are the generals, the men whose actual job is turning Hitler's orders into a real defense of Berlin, and who are increasingly professionally certain that the orders coming out of that room no longer match reality on the ground. General Helmuth Weidling is one of them. On April 23rd, he's handed command of the entire Berlin defense area, a patchwork of exhausted troops, Volkssturm grandfathers, and Hitler youth boys, against two Soviet army groups closing in from three sides. Days earlier, Hitler had actually put Weidling on a list to be shot over a misunderstanding. Instead, he ends up running the defense of the capital. He knows, from the moment he takes the job, it cannot be held. He takes it anyway, because refusing means execution. What Weidling inherits is less a defense plan than a collection of desperate improvisations stitched together under fire. The city is divided into 8 defense sectors, each assigned a letter, each theoretically commanded by an experienced officer with a coherent force under him. In practice, several of those sectors have almost no organized troops at all, just scattered pockets of Volkssturm, police auxiliaries, and stragglers from shattered regular units, doing their best to hold ground with radios that don't work and supply lines that don't exist. Weidling spends what remains of his command trying to shift resources between sectors that are collapsing faster than reports of the collapse can even reach him. Albert Speer, the armaments minister, holds the strangest position of all. One of the only men left with genuine personal affection from Hitler, and one of the very few already working, quietly, against the regime's final orders. What Speer's about to do with that trust becomes one of the most consequential acts of quiet defiance to come out of the entire Nazi leadership. We'll come back to exactly what it costs him. And above them all, shuffling through the corridors in an old gray jacket, is a man whose body is visibly failing. Hitler's left hand and leg shake uncontrollably now, a symptom some historians attribute to Parkinson's, worsened by years of medication from a personal physician most of the inner circle privately consider a quack. His back is stooped. His eyes are sunken. The hypnotic public speaker, who once held stadiums in total silence, now struggles to walk a bunker corridor without support. For years, his personal physician has been administering a rotating cocktail of injections and pill stimulants, sedatives, and dozens of other compounds, some of dubious medical value, even by the standards of the time, a regimen several of the other doctors and officials around Hitler have quietly worried about for years without ever daring to intervene directly. By April 1945, whatever combination of genuine neurological illness and years of unregulated medication has done to his body and mind, the result is visible to everyone in that bunker. Whether they say it out loud or not, the man is failing, physically, in ways no speech and no willpower can disguise anymore. Every person in this room is quietly asking the same question. What happens when the man giving the orders has no army left to give them to? 2 days from now, they get their answer, and it's going to be the loudest 45 minutes any of them have ever survived. Life in that concrete box settles into a strange, grinding routine, dictated almost entirely by Hitler's own habits that barely change even as the world above collapses. He sleeps late into the morning, a holdover from decades of nocturnal living. Briefings happen in the early afternoon, then again late at night, sometimes stretching past midnight, as Hitler questions individual unit positions with an intensity that has nothing left to actually change. Meals are small, often vegetarian, prepared by a kitchen staff who keep cooking as though the routines of normal life might, through sheer repetition, hold back what's happening outside. Between briefings, he talks sometimes for long stretches to whoever's in the room about his dog, a German shepherd named Blondie, about architecture, about the Berlin he'd once dreamed of rebuilding as the capital of a 1,000-year empire, a city of monuments now being reduced, floor by floor, to the exact rubble the bombs and the artillery are making of it above their heads. The space itself starts feeling smaller with each passing day, not because it's shrinking, but because more of the collapse above filters down into it. Refugees and wounded soldiers crowd the chancellery ruins overhead. The generators occasionally sputter, dimming the lights, reminding everyone in the most basic possible way how little is left holding this operation together. No fuel, no light, no radio contact, with a Reich that stretches, by this point, barely a few square miles beyond the garden above them. Here's the part of this story that sounds too strange to be true, except every witness in the room describes it almost exactly the same way. On the situation map still updated daily in the bunker, there are colored blocks and arrows representing armies positioned to save Berlin. On paper, it looks almost coherent, forces converging from north and south to crush the Soviet spearheads. The problem is that most of what those blocks represent doesn't exist anymore. The most infamous of them becomes known, in every account, simply as Steiner's attack. SS Obergruppenführer Felix Steiner is ordered to counterattack from the north with a force the map calls Armeeabteilung Steiner Army Detachment Steiner. Hitler treats it, in the days before April 22nd, as the turning point that saves the capital. There is no army. What actually exists under Steiner's command is a loose scattering of exhausted understrength units, some without ammunition, some without fuel, some that simply don't answer their radios because they've already been overrun. Steiner, a professional soldier, understands immediately that this attack isn't just difficult. It's fictional. He never launches it. There's nothing to launch. On the afternoon of April 22nd, during the daily briefing, Hitler asks for an update on Steiner's attack. The answer? It never happened. Because the army to carry it out never existed the way the map claimed. What happens next, according to everyone in the room, is the single most dramatic breakdown of Hitler's entire life. He erupts screaming, shaking, a tirade lasting close to half an hour at his generals, at the army, at the German people themselves, whom he accuses of failing him, of not deserving the vision he tried to give them. It's the sound of a man's entire self-image collapsing in real time, in front of the last people on earth still forced to listen. And then, something changes. For the first time in the entire war, Hitler says, out loud, in front of witnesses, the war is lost. He announces he's staying in Berlin. He won't flee south to the mountain retreat, prepared as a last redoubt, the so-called Alpine fortress that propaganda had spent months building up as a potential final stronghold, and that, in reality, existed mostly as another line on a map. No more substantial than the phantom armies surrounding it. He'll remain in the capital until the end, and when the end comes, he'll take his own life rather than be captured. This is the moment the 10 days really begin. Not the birthday, not the cake. April 22nd, a screaming fit over an army that was never real, when the man at the center of everything finally admits there's nothing left to command. Everyone in that room will remember this moment differently for the rest of their lives, some describing it as the instant they finally understood the war was truly over, others describing a strange, unexpected relief, as if a weight they'd been carrying without realizing it had finally been set down. But admitting it doesn't stop him from trying anyway. There's still General Walther Wenck's 12th Army, a real force, one of the few still intact, originally fighting the Americans on the Western Front. Hitler orders it turned around, redirected entirely toward Berlin, to break through and save the city. Wenck actually attempts it. His army advances, makes contact, fights its way toward the outskirts near Potsdam, engaging Soviet forces in genuine, costly fighting that has nothing symbolic or theoretical about it for the soldiers doing it. But it's one army outnumbered, out of position, exhausted from days of forced marching across a collapsing front, against a force that has the entire capital surrounded on three sides, with overwhelming numbers. Radio messages between Wenck's headquarters and the bunker grow increasingly strained over these days. Wenck reporting real but limited progress. The bunker interpreting that progress as confirmation that rescue remains imminent. It's not a rescue. It becomes a desperate secondary battle that lets some soldiers and civilians escape west and surrender to the Americans instead of the Soviets, a real, meaningful outcome for the tens of thousands of people it saves from Soviet captivity. But nowhere close to the salvation the map in the bunker still pretends is coming. For a week after admitting defeat, Hitler keeps asking about Wenck's progress. Keeps moving markers for an army everyone else in the room understands with growing dread cannot possibly arrive in time. There's something almost unbearably human in how this plays out, according to the people who were actually in the room. Officers who know, with total professional certainty, that Wenck's army can't arrive in time, still find themselves nodding along in the briefings, still pointing to positions on the map because the alternative, telling the increasingly volatile man in front of them that his last hope is fiction, carries consequences none of them are willing to test. Loyalty, fear, and a kind of exhausted resignation blur together into a strange collective performance, everyone in the room playing along with a plan they privately know is already dead, because playing along has become easier than telling the truth. Meanwhile, back in the bunker, the map still shows the arrows. Still shows Steiner's phantom force, days after everyone in the room knows it was never real. Still shows Wenck's 12th Army, pushing toward a link-up, growing less possible by the hour. It's one of the strangest command posts in the history of modern warfare, a war room run, with total procedural seriousness, tracking forces that exist mostly as ink and colored pencil. For a commander who has already privately conceded, out loud, that none of it will matter. Because 40 feet above them, an entire city is finding out exactly what happens when the rescue everyone's been promised never shows up. Soldiers who believed until the very last briefing that relief was coming now have to reckon, in real time, with the gap between what they were told and what's actually arriving on their street, which is nothing at all, except more Soviet armor. While the map room clings to a rescue that isn't coming, the city above it is going through a different kind of collapse, psychological, not tactical. And this is where the human cost of these 10 days becomes almost impossible to fully describe. Picture a single stairwell in a half-collapsed apartment block near the Landwehr Canal. A Volkssturm unit, 6 men, 3 over 60, 2 boys who lied about their age to be handed a rifle, has been told to hold this building. 1 working anti-tank rocket between them. A scattering of mismatched ammunition. Outside, they can hear the deep hollow thump of tank engines idling somewhere down the street, the rhythmic clatter of tracks on cobblestone. And underneath the machinery, voices, shouted orders in Russian, close enough now to make out individual words. Nobody in that stairwell has slept properly in days. Hunger is a constant background hum, and running through everything is a specific, curdled fear, because they've been told, for years, that surrender means something worse than death. So they wait. Some of them die in that stairwell within the hour. Some slip away in the chaos, shedding uniforms in a bombed-out cellar. A few, if they're extraordinarily lucky, survive to be taken prisoner and spend decades trying to explain what those final days actually felt like, a fear that has nothing to do with courage and everything to do with being 19 or 63, trapped in a city that stopped being a city and became a single continuous killing ground. Multiply that stairwell by thousands, across every district of central Berlin. That's the real texture of these 10 days. Not one dramatic battle, an almost uncountable number of small, terrified moments, connected only by the same distant, increasingly meaningless order still repeating from the bunker. Hold your position, help is coming. And behind the fighting, there's a civilian terror historians still struggle to fully summarize, because the scale of it resists easy description. As Soviet forces moved through the city after nearly 4 years of brutal, merciless warfare on the Eastern Front, a horrifying wave of violence against German civilians, overwhelmingly women, sweeps through Berlin. Historians estimate the number of women affected in the hundreds of thousands. It's one of the great, devastating human costs of the war's final days. That fear, combined with over a decade of propaganda specifically designed to terrify Germans about Soviet occupation, produces something almost unthinkable: a wave of suicides across Berlin. Families choosing death together, rather than face what's coming, a horror that in just a few more days is going to echo one final time. Inside the bunker itself, and above ground, soldiers who fought competently for years start abandoning positions, not because they've been outfought in that moment, but because rumor has convinced them there's nothing left to fight for. By April 29th, the fighting has reached the Reichstag itself, the burned-out parliament building that has stood since a mysterious fire in 1933, as an almost mythic symbol for both sides. For the Soviets, taking it has become an obsession disproportionate to its actual military value. Stalin himself has made clear he wants Soviet soldiers photographed raising a flag over it, a moment of propaganda theater to rival anything Goebbels ever staged. For the exhausted mix of SS foreign volunteers, Hitler Youth, and Volkssturm defending it, the building becomes the site of some of the most brutal close-quarters fighting of the entire Berlin campaign, room by room, floor by floor, grenades thrown down stairwells, bayonets used because ammunition has run out entirely in some positions. On April 30th, the same afternoon Hitler dies less than a mile away, Soviet soldiers manage to raise a flag over the building's damaged dome. Even as fighting continues in the basement and lower floors for another 2 full days, the photograph of that flag becomes one of the most famous images of the entire war taken. Ironically, while the man the entire war had been fought against was already several hours dead in a garden nearby, a fact the soldiers raising that flag wouldn't learn until later that night. There's a detail worth sitting with here, one that separates this final stretch of the war from almost everything that came before it in the German military's history. For years, the Wehrmacht had prided itself, however brutally, however wrongly deployed, on discipline, on coordination, on the idea that a well-drilled force could outthink and outmaneuver a larger, cruder one. For years, that self-image had been reinforced by genuine early successes: the speed of the campaigns in Poland and France, the coordination between armor, infantry, and air power that had briefly made the Wehrmacht look almost unstoppable. That entire self-image collapses inside Berlin's final 10 days. Units lose contact with neighboring units by simple virtue of a single collapsed building blocking the line of sight between 2 street corners. Radios run on batteries that can't be replaced. A company commander with 15 years of service finds himself relying on the same kind of desperate improvisation as the 63-year-old grandfather next to him, because the systems that used to separate professional soldiering from chaos have simply stopped functioning. Not far from that stairwell, in a cellar beneath what used to be a bakery, a different scene plays out. A mother and her 3 children have been sheltering there for 6 days, surfacing only at night to search for water. She has heard, from a neighbor who heard it from someone else, that the fighting will be over within 48 hours, a rumor that has already been wrong twice this week. She doesn't know whether to believe it a third time. She has stopped believing almost everything by this point, except the sound of her own children breathing in the dark, which she counts over and over, the way some people count sheep. Multiply her by tens of thousands of Berlin households, and you start to understand that the real casualty of these 10 days isn't only measured in bodies. It's measured in the specific, grinding erosion of every ordinary certainty a person needs simply to function. When will there be food? Is this street safe? Will tomorrow be different from today? Below ground, the map still shows Wenck's army advancing toward a city that's already stopped believing anyone is coming. Here's where arrogance's final cost becomes unbearably specific: not an idea, but one order, issued weeks earlier, and one man's quiet decision to make sure it was never fully carried out. On March 19th, a month before the 10 days even begin, But shaping every one of them, Hitler issues what becomes known as the Nero Decree. As German forces retreat, they're ordered to destroy everything of military, industrial, or civilian value on German soil itself. Bridges, factories, power stations, railways, the infrastructure and entire population, the same population Hitler claims to be fighting for, will need to survive whatever comes after. It's an order to burn down Germany's own future rather than let it fall into enemy hands. Albert Speer reads it and understands immediately what it is. Not strategy. A tantrum turned into policy. If Germany can't win, it deserves to be left with nothing. Speer does something almost no one else in the senior leadership dares at this stage. He pushes back. Not open defiance, that means arrest, or worse. A quiet, methodical campaign of persuasion, and where persuasion fails, direct sabotage. He travels personally to army and regional commanders, and instructs many of them not to carry out the destruction or to fake it, disabling rather than annihilating. He argues that leveling Germany's infrastructure won't stop the Allied advance. It will only guarantee the German people have nothing left to survive on, regardless of who wins. It works, often enough to matter. Bridges that would have been dynamited stay standing. Factories that would have been leveled stay intact enough to rebuild. In several documented cases, Speer personally intervenes with local commanders just hours before demolition charges are due to be detonated, arguing, sometimes bluffing outright, about authorization from higher up that the destruction should be delayed, postponed, reconsidered. Some commanders comply out of genuine agreement with his reasoning. Others comply simply because Speer's rank and reputation make it easier to follow his instructions than to question them in the chaos of a collapsing front, where nobody has time to verify orders through normal channels anymore. Speer's quiet defiance becomes one of the reasons Germany's post-war reconstruction doesn't start from an even deeper hole than the one the war already dug. But here's the tragic contrast this story has to sit with, because right alongside Speer's success in undermining that decree, a very different order is being enforced with total, uncompromising rigidity. No retreat, no surrender. Fight to the last man, the last building, the last bullet. Deserters are executed sometimes summarily, sometimes hung in public squares with placards around their necks, a warning to the exhausted defenders of Berlin that the only two futures left are dying in the fighting, or dying for trying to stop. Picture what that enforcement actually looks like from ground level. A patrol of military police, moving through a rear area still nominally under German control, stops a group of soldiers separated from their unit men who may simply be lost in the chaos, who may be genuinely trying to reach a new defensive line, or who may, understandably, be trying to survive a war they can see is already over. There is often no meaningful way to tell the difference in the field, and by this stage, no real inclination among the patrols to try. A brief interrogation, a decision made in minutes, and then, for those judged deserters, a rope thrown over the nearest lamppost or tree branch, a placard scrawled and hung around the neck. The body left in place, not hidden, but deliberately displayed, positioned along roads where other retreating soldiers and fleeing civilians will see it and understand exactly what message it's meant to send. This is the arrogance this entire story has been building toward, made unbearably concrete. Somewhere in Berlin during these 10 days, a Volkssturm grandfather or a 14-year-old boy is killed holding a street corner no competent military mind believes can actually be held killed, enforcing an order from a man who, in his own bunker, has already privately admitted the war is lost, and has already started planning his own death rather than his own capture. The man demanding others fight to the last breath has already decided, for himself, exactly when and how his own fighting ends. Speer's quiet rebellion saves bridges and factories for a Germany that will exist after Hitler is gone. The demand for continued combat in Berlin streets costs lives for a leader who has already, in every way that matters, stopped fighting for anything except how his own ending gets written. Speer's own post-war account describes a man walking a knife's edge, maintaining just enough outward loyalty to avoid arrest, while working, room by room and commander by commander, to make sure the destruction order would be remembered as a document that was issued, not a catastrophe that was carried out. He travels personally to the Ruhr industrial region, in the war's final weeks specifically, to argue against demolishing the factories and mines an entire post-war population will need simply to keep from starving. Historians studying German reconstruction in the years immediately after the war point to his quiet sabotage as a meaningful factor in how quickly certain regions were able to begin rebuilding it all. It's a strange kind of heroism to reckon with a man who spent years as one of the most important architects of the Nazi war machine, using his final weeks inside it to dismantle one of its cruelest orders, not through open rebellion, but through the same bureaucratic tools that built the regime in the first place, now turned quietly against it. And in less than 48 hours, he's going to start writing it. By April 28th, the gap between the bunker and the outside world has become almost total. That evening, a BBC broadcast reaches the bunker with news that detonates whatever remains of Hitler's trust in the people around him. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, one of the most powerful men in the entire regime, a man whose loyalty had never once been publicly questioned, has been secretly negotiating surrender to the Western Allies through a neutral intermediary, entirely without Hitler's knowledge. The reaction, by every account, is pure fury laced with something close to genuine devastation. If Himmler has broken, loyalty itself has stopped meaning anything. Hitler orders the arrest of Himmler's SS liaison in the bunker, Hermann Fegelein, who happens, in one of history's grimmer coincidences, to be married to Eva Braun's sister. Fegelein is found trying to flee the city himself, discovered in civilian clothes at his Berlin apartment, apparently attempting to disappear into the chaos rather than face what was coming in the bunker. He's dragged back under guard, subjected to a brief and largely symbolic hearing, and on Hitler's direct order, executed by firing squad in the Chancellery Garden, one of the very last executions carried out under Hitler's personal authority, of a man connected to him by marriage into his own inner circle. Eva Braun, whose sister is married to Fegelein, reportedly pleads for his life. It makes no difference. By this point, Hitler's fury at the betrayal has overridden whatever family loyalty might once have mattered. That same day, word arrives of something else. The death of Benito Mussolini, Hitler's closest ideological ally, captured and executed by Italian partisans. Mussolini's body, along with his mistress, is strung up in a public square in Milan, mutilated by an enraged crowd. When Hitler hears the details, witnesses describe something specific and visceral in his reaction, not grief exactly. Fear. A very personal fear of what might happen to his own body if it falls into enemy hands in anything resembling that condition. Think about what that betrayal actually represents for a moment. Himmler wasn't some peripheral figure with divided loyalties. He was the architect of the SS, the man Hitler had trusted with the darkest and most absolute machinery of the entire regime, a man whose personal devotion had never, not once, in over 2 decades been publicly questioned. If Himmler is negotiating behind Hitler's back, then the very idea Hitler had spent his career selling to an entire nation that unbreakable total loyalty was not just possible, but morally supreme has just collapsed in the most personal way imaginable. It isn't a battlefield loss. It's a betrayal from inside the one relationship Hitler believed was immune to the corrosion the rest of the war had brought. Against that backdrop, betrayal from his most trusted lieutenant, and a vivid preview of what capture might mean for his own corpse, the final arrangements of these 10 days start moving fast. Just after midnight, moving into April 29th, Hitler marries Eva Braun in a brief civil ceremony in the bunker's map room, the same room where phantom armies had been tracked across a map for the past week, now hosting a wedding. Afterward, he dictates his last will and political testament to one of his secretaries. Even in its final lines, the document refuses any self-reflection, blaming the war on others, offering no remorse, no acknowledgement of what the preceding 12 years had actually cost the world. It goes further still. Using its closing paragraphs to expel from the party the very men whose betrayals had shaken him days earlier, a final act of bureaucratic housekeeping, delivered from a bunker with no power left to enforce it, against men who, in most cases, no longer cared whether they were expelled from anything. It reads in places less like the final testament of a man reckoning with the scale of what he caused, and more like the minutes of a meeting that continues out of sheer habit long after everyone who mattered has already left the room. The writing of a man narrating his own ending exactly the way he's narrated everything else, as something done to him, never something he did. On April 30th, the news from the surface keeps getting worse by the hour. Soviet forces push to within a few hundred meters of the Reich Chancellery itself. Fighting is reported near the Reichstag. General Weidling reports ammunition and food nearly exhausted, organized defense collapsing into isolated pockets that can't hold much longer. Runners bringing these reports down into the bunker describe streets they can no longer recognize, familiar intersections reduced to craters and rubble. Landmarks that had stood for generations simply gone, replaced by the same gray wreckage, repeating block after block. Sometime after lunch eaten quietly, almost normally, with two secretaries and the cook. As though this were simply another item on a list, Hitler says his final goodbyes. A brief, quiet procession through the corridor, handshakes with people who've worked alongside him for over a decade. Several accounts describe him as unusually calm in these final exchanges, a striking contrast to the screaming collapse of April 22nd, as though finally admitting defeat 8 days earlier had, in its own way, let something go. Eva Braun changes into a dark dress. Witnesses describe her as composed, even as everyone around her struggles to hold together. She has had, in a sense, more time than almost anyone else in that bunker to prepare for this exact moment. She came to Berlin knowing, on some level, how this was likely to end, and chose to be there anyway. There is a strange, quiet detail from that final morning that several witnesses recall independently, and it says as much about these 10 days as anything else in the entire story. Even as Soviet troops fight their way toward the Reichstag less than a mile away, even as the briefings have become almost meaningless, reporting the collapse of positions that fell hours earlier. Information arriving too late to change anything. The bunker's small domestic routines continue right up to the end. The cook still prepares food. The secretaries still sit at their typewriters. It is, in its own way, the last and strangest performance of normalcy in a war built almost entirely on performance. At 3:30 in the afternoon, the door to the private study closes. And that's it. That's the sound this entire story started with. One gunshot, muffled by a heavy door, followed by a silence several witnesses specifically remember as unbearable nothing but the diesel generators, humming on, exactly like they had every other day. A pause, long enough that some of those waiting outside start to wonder if they should go in. Then the door opens. Bodies are wrapped in blankets, carried up the narrow bunker stairs quickly, aware that Soviet artillery is still landing in and around the Chancellery grounds. In the garden, the same garden where, 10 days earlier, a camera caught Hitler patting the cheeks of 14-year-old boys, the bodies are laid in a shallow depression, doused with cans of gasoline scavenged from the Chancellery's dwindling fuel supply, and set alight. The men carrying out this hurried cremation stand at a distance under incoming fire, some saluting as the flames catch, before retreating underground, leaving the fire to finish its work through the rest of the afternoon. It is, in its own grim way, the least ceremonial ending imaginable for a man who had spent over a decade obsessed with staged spectacle, no crowd, no anthem, no carefully arranged photograph. Just a handful of exhausted aides, working quickly under fire, trying to finish before the next artillery round found the garden. The bunker doesn't stop functioning immediately. General Hans Krebs, the last chief of the Army General Staff, is sent under a white flag to negotiate with the Soviet command, hoping to secure terms that might spare at least some of the remaining garrison. The Soviets, having fought for years toward exactly this outcome, are not remotely interested in anything short of unconditional surrender, and the negotiation collapses within hours. Over the following 2 days, the bunker slowly empties, as remaining staff try to break out of the city in small groups under cover of darkness, scattering across a war zone with wildly uneven odds of survival. Some groups make it across the Elbe to surrender to the Americans. Others are caught in the open by Soviet patrols within blocks of the bunker they'd just left. Krebs himself does not attempt to escape. Along with several other senior officers, he takes his own life in the bunker complex rather than surrender. On May 1st, in a room not far from where Hitler died the day before, Joseph and Magda Goebbels complete a plan they'd been quietly circling for days. In the days leading up to it, the children, unaware of what's coming, had continued something close to a normal bunker routine, playing in the corridors, singing songs for the staff, entirely unaware that their parents had already decided, weeks earlier, that a world without the Nazi regime in it was not one they would be allowed to grow up in. The youngest, 4 years old, and the oldest, 12, are given a sedative by the family doctor, told they were being inoculated. While they sleep, cyanide is administered. Joseph and Magda then go up into the same garden and take their own lives near the same scorched patch of earth where their leader's remains still lie. It stands, even set against everything else in this story, as one of its most devastating single, Act 6 children, none of whom had any part in the decisions that built or destroyed the regime around them, whose entire lives ended as a final, horrifying act of ideological loyalty by the two adults responsible for keeping them alive. By the time General Weidling formally surrenders the city on May 2nd, the bunker that had spent its final 10 days as the operational and increasingly entirely imaginary center of the German war effort is essentially empty. A concrete shell, already being picked through by advancing Soviet soldiers, who find the remnants of a command post that had, for its last week, been directing a war that had already ended everywhere except inside that room. Soviet intelligence teams spend weeks afterward trying to piece together exactly what happened in that garden interviewing captured bunker staff, examining the scorched crater, trying to confirm beyond doubt that the man responsible for the deaths of tens of millions of people across Europe was actually, finally, dead, for years afterward. Rumors persist some of them stayed encouraged by Soviet authorities for their own propaganda reasons that Hitler somehow escaped, that the body in the crater wasn't really his. It takes decades, and eventually the fall of the Soviet Union itself, before fuller forensic and archival evidence removes any remaining doubt. The man who spent his final week directing armies that didn't exist spends the decades after his death as a rumor that, in its own strange way, refused to fully die either a final, unintentional echo of the exact kind of fiction that defined his last 10 days alive. 10 days. That's the entire distance between the last photograph of Hitler standing in daylight, patting the cheeks of 14-year-old boys, wearing medals for a defense that was already failing, and a shell crater in the same garden, holding what was left of him. In between those 10 days sits the whole shape of the paradox this story opened with. A man who spent over a decade demanding absolute obedience, absolute sacrifice, absolute belief in his own judgment commanding. In the end, nothing but a concrete room, a fantasy army on a map, and the exact terms of his own disappearance. The boys in that garden on April 20th were told they were defending the future. By April 30th, the man who told them that had already decided his own future would last exactly 10 more days and spent every one of them making sure the rest of the world kept paying for a war he'd privately already conceded was lost. Somewhere in Berlin, right now, there's still a bridge standing because Albert Speer quietly refused to burn it. And somewhere in that same city, there's still a street corner where a boy who should have been in a classroom died, holding a position that everyone, including the man who ordered it held, already knew couldn't be saved. 6 days after that gunshot in the bunker, on May 8th, Germany surrenders unconditionally. The war that reshaped the entire world, that cost tens of millions of lives across 6 continents, is finally, officially, over in Europe. It ends not with the dramatic last stand the propaganda had spent 12 years promising, but with paperwork, signed in a schoolhouse in Reims, and ratified a day later in Berlin, the final, quiet administrative footnote to a war that had already, in every way that mattered, ended in a scorched patch of garden 10 days earlier. The 4 million soldiers Hitler once commanded didn't disappear because of one bullet in one bunker. They were already gone killed, captured, scattered, or simply walking home through a landscape of rubble long before that door ever closed. What that single gunshot actually ended wasn't an army. It was a fiction. The fiction of a map with pencil arrows pointing toward armies that no longer existed. The fiction of a man who told an entire nation, right up to his final week, that victory was still possible, while privately, days earlier, he'd already picked out the room he was going to die in. There's a version of this story that ends simply with a man getting exactly what his arrogance earned him a fitting, almost satisfying collapse. But the real accounting is harder than that, and less satisfying. The cost of those 10 days wasn't paid by the man in the bunker. It was paid by 14-year-olds in stairwells, by grandfathers hanged from lampposts for trying to survive, by 6 children who never got a vote in the ideology that ended their lives, by mothers counting their children's breathing in cellars across a dying city. He got a bullet, on his own terms, in a room he chose. Almost no one else in this story got to choose anything at all. That's the final order in this story. Not a command given. A silence left behind that an entire city was still bleeding to fill.